Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. My name, again, is Maria Palacios. My pronouns are she, her. And I am truly excited to be sharing space with you today. I'm one of those crips from the past. Bear with me for a second. Can you please shut the door for me? Shut the door for me. And yeah, before officially getting started, I wanted to name a couple of access needs. I come from the world of disability justice, and naming our access needs is kind of how do we begin letting everybody know. So my access needs are that I have dogs that might bark, and if they do, I will probably more than likely mute myself until the barking subsides. And also I tend to be kind of jittery a little bit. So if you see me moving around, and also sometimes I have difficulty seeing. I don't have glasses right now. So if you see me, and I have prepared my presentation on my phone, so I'll be looking at my phone. Anyway, having said that, again, thank you so much for welcoming me into this space. My name is Maria Palacios. My pronouns are she, her. And I am one of those crips from the movement, and I have a lot of pride about my participation in the cultural crip evolution and crip revolution that is responsible for how we move forward now. And I say it like that with a lot of crip love, a lot. As you might already know, I'm one of those crips from back in the day that helped pass the ADA, did the Capitol Crawl, so I have a lot of experience. And also my very first job, and over the years, I have worked closely with sales, especially here, my local one. And I have a lot of love for you guys, a lot of love for the movement. So it is a joy to be here. I am grateful for the space. I am so happy to be invited to sit at this table of change and advocacy while representing my whole true self. I was invited to be here today so that we can together explore ways to be more inclusive in our outreach and make sure disabled consumers who identify as LGBTQIA are not left out or made to feel like they can be themselves in order to be part of the movement, part of the change IL centers bring to the lives of disabled people. And that is so important, to be able to be ourselves. And being able to be myself is not something that I have always owned or had as someone who identifies as queer. I know that I'll keep talking more about this, but I just had to say how important that is, to be able to be here as my true self. So in the conversation that we are having today, I know that the reason why Jack and I are here is because we want to make sure that we are being inclusive, that we are not leaving behind our brothers and sisters with disabilities from this particular community, which is no secret. It's happened. It's been happening. We have been leaving people behind. The movement itself has struggled with inclusion of more diverse representation, and we want to address that. We want to address how the intersections between homophobia and ableism affect the way we interact with queer communities. We want to try to find, even if it's the tip of the iceberg, so we can then begin to go deeper and deeper into the factors that contribute to the way we have historically left some people out. So in that conversation, in our attempts to understand the why and the how and the who of things, let's first address some of the issues that sales face. I think that it's important for us to do what we're doing, to learn what we're learning, like you guys have invited us here, so you can learn from our experience, so we can bring representation, visibility. But I think it's also important to touch on some of the things that have kept sales stuck in that position of having minimum or no representation from certain minority groups. So in thinking about this presentation, I put myself first as a consumer, and my memory of my personal experience as a disabled person. I put myself being in the energy of what the sale represents. And I started then thinking about my own experience as a queer person, as a brown queer person, as an immigrant, and all my different identities, all my different intersections kind of surfaced. And And it's surprising when we do that, you know, the things that we learn, the things that come up. So I created like a little list of bullets, which we're going to go one by one, addressing some of the factors that I have observed. And I'm not right now in the IL movement full force, you know, as I was before, like working for a SIL, being like in the front lines of everything that you guys do. But as we know, when you're a disabled person and you have experience with the independent living movement, when you have been touched by the energy of consumer-driven services, and when you have been part of that fabric of independent living that we represent, notice that I say we when we talk about sales, because I very much consider myself still a very strong part of this fabric, a very, very big part of this community. So as disabled people, you know, we're going to start addressing some of the things that came to my mind as I started thinking, you know, what do sales face when it comes to reaching out to queer communities? So as disabled people, number one, as disabled people, we're almost always denied body ownership and the right to own our sexuality. You know, let's think about that for a second, because being queer, or it's about gender identity, it's about sexuality, it's about sexual identity, it's about something that as disabled people, we have been denied. You know, whether we grew up disabled or we acquired a disability later in life, anything to do with sexual identity, even gender identity, sexual orientation, it gets taken away from us. It gets denied to us. You know, the fact that to this day, as disabled people, we continue fighting for the right to own our bodies. Let's think about that for a minute as a major, major obstacle to everything else that has to do with personal identity. And even more so when it comes to queer identity, right? So let's think about that. We have to fight for the right to own our bodies, and we are often fighting our own internalized ableism and other personal wars, making the process of being more aware and open to diversity a longer process. A longer process. So that's one factor. Then many times disabled queer people stay in the closet much longer, or may take a lot longer to embrace a queer identity, if they ever do. And again, everything seems to be connected in so many ways and at so many levels. This particular bullet that I just said, it connects back to the first one that I just said. If we get denied access to our own bodies in the most basic forms, the more significant the disability, as we know, the more access to support we will need. And the more help that we need, the more we depend upon the non-disabled world, attendants, doctors, medical model, friends, family, you know. So it is very easy for disabled people to disassociate and feel like we don't own our bodies. And if we get to the point of not feeling that we don't own our bodies, then every other form of identity around that body that we're occupying becomes blurred, becomes difficult. You know, so staying in the closet, I know I myself stay in the closet for so long. For so long, I hid behind heterosexual lies for so long. Even my partner of 20 years, I mean, it's so hard. It's so hard because the level of oppression is so brutal that a lot of times we just go with the flow, you know, and we'll keep talking more about that. So another factor is that we're already shamed for living in our disabled body minds. So there already exists a lot of shame around disability. So queerness may cast even more shame. Being disabled and queer in some cultures could mean a death sentence. You know, so let's take that into perspective. The communities that we serve, the disabled people that we serve, they're not all from one single intersection. I know that we talked about intersectionality before. We recognize that we are all many things. Our disability is not the only representation that we live, you know? So there's a lot of shame, a lot of guilt, a lot of taboos around disability itself. Imagine adding queerness to that, right? It makes it harder. It makes it harder to approach people. It makes it harder to deal with even with our own identities. So let's keep in mind what queer means in other cultures. Let's keep in mind what disability means in other cultures and how the intersection of both, coupled with capitalism, ableism, racism, and all the other isms. What a horrible bundle for people to have to deal with, you know, what a bunch of layers of oppression for people to have to peel. So another thing is disabled queer spaces have mainly existed in the underground and in the background of most movements and slowly begin to emerge, claiming the power and beauty of the queer intersection. You know, so let's think about all that. It's not that we don't exist. It's not that we don't exist. We exist underground. We exist in hidden spaces. We exist in the safe spaces that we create so that we can be safe, so that we can be ourselves, so that we cannot be afraid to say, I'm queer, I'm gay, I'm trans, I'm intersex. You know, at the end of the day, these are all labels in reality. So yeah, this queer disabled people exist. We exist in underground spaces. And I work for a brown queer performance art organization. And I can tell you, like little by little over the last 20 years, we have been like coming out in a safer mode, feeling safe even with each other. There's, oh my gosh, there's so many obstacles. Also, we as a movement have been moving on a very straight line. I love how that pun ended up, you know, we've been moving on a very straight line. Nothing wrong with a straight line, you know, except that straight and narrow makes it difficult for everybody else to also walk that line. You know, I want to be walking in your straight line by wiggling. I want my crooked line to join your straight line, you know? So the movement has been too straight. There's nothing wrong with being straight, but let's not be so narrow, right? Let's see. We have had little or no positive exposure to queer communities. That's very important. Little or no positive exposure, because I'm not going to assume that you have had no exposure. After all, queer people exist at every intersection. We're everywhere, okay? So you have had exposure, but has it been positive? You know, I recently came back from a conference where this awesome woman from an independent living center in St. Louis, and she's queer, she's a lesbian, and she's so badass that she really inspired me. I went to her workshop, and she talked about how to help people change their heart and minds about communities or people that are different, you know, because there's a lot of stereotypes, there are a lot of misconceptions, a lot of taboos, a lot of anger, a lot of fear. And so what she said mainly was that she was raised in a very religious, strict, super religious background, right? As it happens to a lot of queer people, you know, we think that we're going to damn in hell for a while until we discover, oh. But anyway, her experience was that one day she was riding in the car with a Muslim woman. And my friend said to this woman, well, I hope one day you find Jesus. And the whole conversation started about about, hey, what if I don't find Jesus? What if I don't want to find Jesus? What if my religion or my version of God is different? And so the whole point is that she ended up having such a powerful, positive encounter and conversation with this person that it made her realize that it was those small but positive encounters that begin to make a difference and form a different opinion about the people that we formerly feared or judged or didn't understand, you know? So it takes all those interactions, and we have to create opportunity for them. Oh my God, I'm at 1:18 and I'm like, I still have so much to cover. So please, I'll try to rush. See, I'm being aware of time here. Let's see. Yes. We as a movement, the IL movement, yes, I already said that we have been walking on a straight line. We have had little or no positive exposure to queer communities. Disabled people often stay longer in the closet. I just said that. It might take that much longer to recognize our own identity, and because of ableism, you know, so I'm kind of like repeating what I just said from the heart, even though I had prepared the bullets. So it is very important to continue learning from our own process. We cannot just attend a training and go back to where we were. This is just the beginning. We're kind of like opening a little door. So, and I apologize for talking fast, interpreters. I'll try to slow down a little bit. I tend to get passionate when I present, and I'm like, oh, because I'm racing this time and I want to cover everything. But here, the next section is I want to talk a little bit about the intersection of queer and crip, because most people might not realize how much we share, how much in common we have in our fight for equality. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to mention some words that immediately are going to make you realize what I just said. And these are painful words, by the way, painful words that we share in our own individual fights for justice, in our own movement. Forced normalization, considered a sin, a punishment from God, abnormal, feared, rejected, bullied, ridiculed, hated, abandoned, denied body ownership, labeled, hidden from society, forced to pass, expected to conform, marginalized, institutionalized, murdered. Murdered. That's how feared and how hated some groups of people are. The words, and also let's think about how religious oppression plays a role in the lives of disabled and queer people and disabled queer people. How religion wants to heal us, force their version of God in our lives, condemn us to hell, deny us entrance to the table, view queer lives as a violation to humanity. And it's so painful to realize and recognize that all these painful words are the main connector between our communities, between these identities. There's a lot of shared oppression at the intersection of queer and crip, but we must recognize that this shared oppression must lead us to collective liberation. It must lead us to working together, to remembering that needing each other is how we become each other's allies. Needing each other is not a weakness, it's the strength that keeps us alive. And this level of oppression that we are surviving, we need each other. Think about Section 504, the San Francisco sit-in, how people were able to stay in the protest for as long as they did because the Black Panthers were there supporting them. We need each other in the movement, across movements, across generations, across identities. We need each other. And that is the very first thing that we need to recognize in order to change what's systematically wrong in the way that we serve queer disabled consumers. So taking back the power, I always like to say that crip and queer is how we take back our power through love. The word queer is a word that I love. The word crip is a word that I love, because both words represent part of my identity that is so undeniable and so powerful and so beautiful. It makes who I am. And I know that that is the case for all queer disabled people. And at least, when you come to understand and love your identities. So queer is beautiful, crip is beautiful. Let's flip the narrative around. Let's see queer, crip, as powerful, diverse, as survivors, as worthy, as capable, as resilient, because we are all those things. Let's not continue only accepting the painful words as the unifying factors between these two intersections, right? So briefly, 3 minutes, I promise. I have a little bullet list of what to do, because it's easy to say this is what's wrong, this is what's wrong, this is what's wrong, this is what's wrong, this is what we identify as what we are not doing, this is how we, in other words, I already told you what we have been doing or not doing, but I want to leave you with my part of presentation with something, with some kind of tools, with something to hold on to build upon. But let's please remember that tools only work when we put them to use, when we use them to build something, right? And this little bullet of things that I'm going to tell you next, I'm going to email to Abby later on so that you all can have it, okay? So first and foremost, see our humanity. we are no different. When we talk about disabled people, I could easily do this presentation in a full hour, you know. Really, each one of us, Jack and I, could probably use a full hour in these presentations because there's so much to say. Then we have to become more intentional with the way we communicate or offer support to queer communities, being purposeful in the way we learn and embrace those who differ from our own identity. Also, start the conversation, talk about sex and sexuality and gender identity and feelings and taboos. We have to begin. Only then, when we have that conversation, do we begin to address all the other areas of this. Also, we cannot ask people to come into our spaces but refuse to go into theirs. When was the last time that any of you, and I don't know how many of you are queer or anything, but when was the last time that anybody went into a queer space with that feeling that they didn't belong, or like, oh my God, they're gonna think I'm gay, you know, that homophobic shit. Okay, I'm sorry. Forgive my French. I'm getting too passionate here. Why do they call it French anyway? Okay. We must create more opportunity for education and conversation about the realities of queer and trans people. You know, this is just like, again, I said, the tip of the iceberg, because we don't know. We have so many commonalities and so many things that we shared oppression, shared liberation, but we need to know more, just the same way that we want the non-disabled world to know about our struggles. Same thing. We must address internalized homophobia and transphobia and stop it in its tracks. Stop it in its tracks. The same way that we have to stop ableism in its tracks. We have to have zero tolerance. Zero tolerance for homophobia, transphobia, or anything. And we have to address it by continuing our education, by continuing the conversation, because sometimes people don't know that they're being offensive. And that's the truth. That's the truth. I could come up with a million examples of offensive things that people had said in my presence about queer communities or disabled communities or about that intersection, and they have no clue that they have been offensive. So it's very important to continue learning, to continue using the proper language. Celebrate with us. Celebrate with us. We have a whole month of Pride Month. Why don't you celebrate with us? Do you celebrate with us? Right? I know I saw your camera on. Okay. I'll pick the most important ones. You must strip your own taboos and respect the way people in their own body, minds, and personal lives embody the experience. Recognize your own privilege. Recognize your own privilege, please. Please. You have heterosexual privilege. If you're heterosexual, you can hold hands with somebody. You can be yourself anywhere. We're not asking for much. Familiarize yourselves with local resources that specifically serve the queer community. Educate them about disability issues. You want to reach out to queer communities? Don't expect all the queer Crips to come to you. What the heck is that? We have to go to their spaces. We have to go to their spaces and educate the non-disabled queers, because sooner or later, they'll be one of us. Nothing is different. We are still human. Anyway, question our own personal values and reasons to leave people out, because values can change. I want to thank you so much for putting up with my super fast talking. And remember that this needs to continue. This is just the beginning of the conversation. We are only getting warmed up. We are only getting started. It is now my pleasure to pass it on to Jack, who is going to give us an amazing ride through language and history and all of the things that need to be part of this. So I want to thank you. I love you all. And yeah, I'm going to turn off my camera to rest my eyes for a minute. Thank you so much. I'll turn it back on when Jack is done. Check.
Thank you so much, Maria, for sharing all of that wisdom with us. Sincerely, I am taking a moment. I was taking it all in, and I'm still doing so now. I honestly couldn't have asked for a better place to come into the conversation, because you are completely right. We are just getting started, and there is so much of an overlap here, both in terms of oppression, but also truly in history and in terms of identity. So I'll introduce myself for a second. My name is Jack Bruno. I use the he series pronouns, he, him, his. I am trained by profession as a social worker, and I'm located in Western Mass, and newly relocated from Boston into a more rural area to work in a trans health clinic out here. I'm so excited to have been invited and to join you all this afternoon. So, as Maria mentioned, the bulk of my portion of our session will be on terminology and history, because, don't necessarily want to assume that everyone has the same familiarity with concepts, with vocabulary. And so we wanted to kind of start from the beginning and build up. I don't know if you do have this familiarity. I would offer people the opportunity maybe to use this time to think about how you might explain this or bring in your colleagues that may be less familiar with these terms. So if you have these down, great. Practice how you would bring other people into that conversation during this time. And like with all language, this is ever changing, varies by community, varies regionally by generation. And so you might know terms that I don't. Things might be different where you are. This is not meant to be prescriptive, but rather descriptive of what we know about what people are using in the community. So let's jump in. So we want to get started in talking about addressing the difference between sex assigned at birth and gender. This can be a point where people might get a little bit stuck. And we think about sex assigned at birth as referring to the sex folks are sorted into by doctors primarily when they're born, either male or female or intersex. And this is based on a combination of physical attributes, namely the appearance of one's external genitalia and additional biological and chromosomal traits. It's different from one's gender, which is a complex set of expectations, roles, and characteristics that combine to create social and, in fact, legal categories called men and women when working on a gender binary. And we know that these two categories may not align for everyone. Someone may be assigned female sex at birth, but throughout their lives have a masculine gender and live as a man. So we'll go more into that in a second, but in short, sex refers to how we group people's bodies, and we can think about the implications for that for people who are born with differences in sex development, and people, for disabled folks who are also having additional judgments based from medical models on bodies. And gender, of course, refers to how we group people in terms of communication style, appearance, styles of dress, and so on. Literally every other aspect of the person. We can also think about differentiating or clarifying sexual and romantic orientation and gender identity, with sexual and romantic orientation describing to whom a person may be attracted to or having an affinity for, which may be based on a person's gender and it may not be. And we can note that not all folks experience sexual or romantic feelings. Some people may experience romantic feelings towards someone. Some people may experience sexual feelings towards someone, but again, those may not align. And gender identity, as we've already discussed, refers to how a person experiences their gender in society, and that's their internal sense of self. And everyone has a sexual or romantic orientation and a gender identity. And though this may change over the course of someone's lives, and people may use different terminology to describe themselves. People get to do that under their own sense of self-determination. For instance, we can think about how a man who is attracted to a man may not be feminine, for example. We're differentiating sexual and romantic orientation from gender identity. And I know we're skipping through these a little bit quickly. There's a lot to cover. What we've been talking about thus far have been binaries such as male, man, woman, male, female, masculine, feminine, or in fact straight or heterosexual or lesbian, gay, bisexual, etc., cisgender and transgender. Binaries, as we think of them here, are marked by mutually exclusive polarized categories wherein one pole is valued over the other. We call these social forces, as we've talked about already, heterosexism, homophobia, sexism, or transphobia. We could also think of other binaries, such as those that underscore racism or classism. So we see that these concepts are categories that are put in opposition to one another, wherein we're seeing this valuing of one over the other. one goal of the work that we're engaging in here is to learn to question these binary assumptions, and introducing additional complexity to the world, um, and expanding this worldview that seeks to force people really into opposing positions that are mutually exclusive. So you must either be a man or a woman. You must either be straight or LGBT. You must either be cisgender or transgender. And even then it gets messy. You can think about this too when we think about ideas of ability, or health, or who inhabits a healthy body or a natural body. Those, I think, are some additional points of intersection or points of overlap when we talk about people who exist in these communities and inhabit bodies. We can expand on the idea of elements of sexual and romantic orientation, like I said, making these ideas more complex, by talking about what is sexual and romantic orientation. We can break that down into really three categories like we've done here, being made up of desire, behavior, and identity. One element being desire. And what gender or genders are you attracted to physically, emotionally? Behavior being what gender or genders are your sexual or romantic partners? And based on identity, what do you consider yourself? And like with some of the other examples we've met so far, these don't always align for folks. We could have someone who is attracted to both men and women, for example, but only engages sexually with men. But they might consider themselves bisexual still, regardless of the fact that they're not currently engaged in sexual or romantic interactions with women. So when we're asking or holding curiosity around someone's sexual or romantic orientation, we're thinking about their desires, their behaviors, and their identities. And that gives us a deeper understanding of people's orientation and actually how they're living in the world. So jumping through, and if you have additional questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A. We're moving through these, like I said, pretty quickly. Yes, Abby, I saw you pop in. Oh, I'm sorry, Abby, I can't actually hear you.
Oh no, my microphone and my microphone were muted. The physical microphone. Becky, I noticed you had a hand up. Did you have a question?
My question was already answered. I put it in the Q&A, but thank you.
Perfect. You got it.
Thank you so much, Becky, for asking that question. These slides will be available. I'm so happy to have these available for folks. Great question. So we can also think about making these nuances in sexuality into spectrums as a way of breaking down that understanding of binary. So when thinking about sexuality as a spectrum, we can think of people who are sexually attracted to or engaged with women, people who are engaged with men, or both. And then we can think about sexual orientation as a collection of spectrums, people who are physically attracted to women, to men, to people of additional genders, and people who are emotionally attracted to women and men, additional genders. So these are different models of being able to think about how people orient themselves to others in a way that is different from our binary understandings that are more prevalent and more reinforce heterosexist or homophobic ideas of what it means to be a person relating to others. And so with a greater understanding of really the nuances and possibilities of sexual orientation, we can dive into kind of a glossary approach to sexual orientation identity words. And this is just a list on the screen right now of ways that people might identify. We have listed asexual or aromantic, bisexual, demisexual, demiromantic, gay, heterosexual, heteromantic, homosexual, homoromantic, lesbian, pansexual, panromantic, straight, queer, and honestly, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are so many more words and terms that folks might use to describe themselves. I think that's really neat. These are ways for folks to also orient themselves, explore their own sense of identity, and find others, right? How connect with others and find a sense of community. So I wanted to share those, and to also share that it's okay to not have a comprehensive encyclopedic understanding of each of these terms. But I just wanted to share that, there may be some here that you don't have familiarity with yet. And you can find glossaries of sexual orientation identity words and gender identity words, which we'll look at in a second, online. There's a ton of resources out there. And when in doubt, if you encounter a consumer or a friend or a family member who uses a word that you're not familiar with yet, it's a great opportunity to lean into that as a learning opportunity. So we've talked so far about sexual orientation, but I wanted to pivot into a greater understanding and deeper understanding of gender identity. And so we can also break down elements of gender identity into identity, expression, and presentation. We know so far that gender identity is our felt sense of self, our internal sense of who we are. Expression and presentation are those external pieces. The gender expression being made up of the external characteristics and behaviors we present to the world through clothing, hairstyles, mannerisms. And I've added gender presentation here as well, which I consider the ways in which folks perform and enact their gender with others. So that's more of the relational aspect of our gender identities. If, for instance, I identify as transmasculine, that's the way that I identify internally. The way that I express that is through clothing, hair, etc. The way that I engage in my gender presentation is the way that I engage with, strangers on the street and my bus driver and, my partner in different ways. All of those expressions and all of those interactions kind of work together to create how I understand myself as a person who is transmasculine. And so in another move towards a more complex understanding of gender, these may not all align for people. A person may be a trans woman, someone who was assigned male sex at birth, but who is now living as a woman, who is now a woman, may present and express her gender in a more butch or masculine way. The way she expresses and presents her gender doesn't undo her gender identity. She's a woman, and she also presents and expresses her womanhood in a more butch or masculine way. I think it's neat. I really love this complexity, and so I'm inviting you to kind of join me, I guess, in that curiosity and join in that exploration. So it's really best practices to not assume anyone's gender identity based solely on their appearance or mannerism. It's another element of self-determination and people having sovereignty over their an aspect of their identity, an often important aspect of their identity. So as with sexual orientation, we can look at gender as a spectrum, as there are folks who have gender identities that are other than man or woman. We can look at a simple spectrum, which is at the top, just an arrow that goes from maybe a more feminine to a more masculine shade. And this allows folks to map out where they fall between two binary poles. However, there are some folks that don't identify along the spectrum at all as existing somewhere between masculine and feminine. That doesn't work for everyone. They may have a gender identity that's outside of that, that's gender neutral or outside of that spectrum altogether. And so we can look at additional spectrums to think through this further. We can include female, male, and other potential scales where folks may rank what categories represent their gender to what extent on both identity and expression. This allows for a more nuanced view, but I'd love to really introduce one additional model. It takes us kind of beyond linear spectrums and into gender maps, color wheels, and more. This is a really incredible thing that I like, visual or graph that I like from Impact, which allows us to have to add some additional complexity around gender identity. On this, there are clouds or bubbles that are connected that represent masculinity and femininity. And we see terms fall under these categories, such as butch, stud, cis man for masculinity, and femme, trans woman, cis woman for femininity. There are also, though, categories that are both or neither. These categories are not dependent on the binary clouds. They don't have a dependent identity on femininity or masculinity. They are their own spaces. Unlike the gender spectrum that positions masculinity and femininity on opposite poles, this model offers non-oppositional variety. It's also interactive. So if you are interested, go to the link on the resources page, which we'll see, and you can check it out. You can zoom in, and they have definitions for some gender identity categories grouped, like I said, in these masculine clouds, feminine clouds, and then the both and neither clouds that aren't, reliant or determined by their proximity to masculinity or femininity. And so, as with the sexual orientation terms, I wanted to just give a few gender identity terms here. There are some umbrella terms like transgender here, trans woman, trans feminine, as well as trans man, trans masculine, gender diverse, cisgender, intersex, genderqueer, non-binary, agender, gender fluid, bigender, and so many more. This is really just the beginning. And I have an asterisk next to intersex because I think it's important to note that some people are assigned intersex at birth and don't identify with intersex as a gender identity term, and some folks do. And so I wanted to hold space for that reality, that some people who have differences in sex development don't consider intersex to be their gender identity. And so it's important to honor that. As with any community, right? No community is a monolith, and your mileage may vary with terms. I see Beck's comment, gender spectrum to an arrow, which I'm interpreting as progress or moving towards a gender universe, galaxy, expansiveness models. And Beck, I hope I'm interpreting that correctly, but that is the movement of my gestures, or that's the movement of my thinking, is that we're moving away from a binary to things that are immutable and not, never the twain shall meet, to a spectrum where those two poles are still there, but we get to kind of slide between the two to a spectrum, or not to a spectrum, rather to a universe where there are just like as many stars in the sky as there are potential gender identities and potential ways of it living and expressing a gendered self. I do see your hand up, Beck. Would you want to elaborate on your comment there or anything?
This is Beck. I am more than happy to elaborate on that comment. However, you seem to cover it. The thing I wanted to, or the thing I raised my hand for, I hope you don't mind my interjection, is that something important to note about intersexuality is it's not something that someone who was, for example, assigned a binary identity at birth, unless the doctor was wrong, it's not something that we can identify as. So for example, I was assigned female at birth and I have female genitalia and characteristics. I can't then say that I'm intersex because there was no medical diagnosis or medical characteristics defining my intersexuality. Over.
Thank you, Beck. No, I appreciate that. Yeah, and I think that you're spot on in that, sometimes there are like chromosomal reasons why someone might discover that they are intersex or have a difference in sex development at a later time when they're older than, infancy, when they're newborns. And that person may have to, kind of reckon with what that means for them and their identity. But yeah, intersex as if someone doesn't have a difference in sex development, if, it's an appropriative step to then have that person claim intersex if that's not as an identity, if that's not the case. Thank you. Yes, Beck also adds there are 26 known variations of intersexuality, and if you are not one of them, it is not likely that you are intersex. Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. And there are places like Interact, where people with differences in sex development, people who are intersex, have been doing really great education and advocacy work. So check that out. Thank you, Beck, for your important additions. And so when we're thinking too about people who are, well, I would say I was going to preface that by saying people who are under the like trans, non-binary, gender diverse, genderqueer, etc. Umbrella, people who are not cisgender, seeking gender affirmation, then we can talk about gender affirmation. But I think it's important to note here that there are many ways in which all people seek some sort of gender affirmation. That's maybe a big topic question. Maybe we can jump into that if we have some time. But when people hear gender affirmation for trans folks, they often think one thing, and usually our minds go straight to surgery. But in fact, there are multiple ways to engage in gender affirmation, some of which are social, like name change or using a new pronoun, are changing legal documents, engaging in hormone therapy to change elements of your embodiment and, like body presentation. And of course, surgical affirmation can be part of that as well. And more and more in more recent times, this has become kind of an a la carte option for folks. I think in previous decades, and maybe in some places still the case, that this is kind of more all or nothing, where social affirmation leads to legal document change, leads to hormone therapy, leads to surgical affirmation. You must have all of them to be considered like actually trans or actually having affirmed one's gender. But there are many ways to engage in this process, and it's highly, highly individual. So I wanted to make a note of that. I also included here a slide focusing on the term queer and its really complex usage, because as Maria spoke to, it can be a really, really powerful and important word, identity term, community term, and has also usage in things like queer studies and queer theory. It can be a verb, a noun, and tagged onto other words like the identity term genderqueer. It can also be painful for some folks. There has been a huge reclamation effort, and yet queer might be a word that folks don't use for themselves or find painful to hear. So again, when engaging with consumers, engaging with people in your life, use the terms that they use for themselves. If you have that relationship with them, when in doubt, ask. When in doubt, maybe tread lightly on things like this. But I did want to name kind of the complexity because I think it's a beautiful word, and I also think it's important that we hold the language and its nuanced history as well. So in talking about kind of terminology, concepts, visibility, I also wanted to share some historical symbols of kind of community and engagement. This is the original pride flag and the meanings of each of the colors, which I think is really neat. We also have, symbols, like the word queer that I've had a reclamation within the community, being the pink and the black triangles, coming out of the, history of attempted like genocide and eradication during World War II, along with the like lambda sign, the double Mars, double Venus. Wanted to kind of share those out and to note that with the advent of the internet and connecting of communities, there's also been a proliferation of identity terms and symbols that we've seen kind of like spring up, which I think has been really cool, also really neat. And I wanted to share some of that with you as well, that there are ways that people have been indicating, specific identities or specific involvement in their communities. And like terminology, like these symbols are always changing or often changing. And some, I will often find a flag that's brand new to me. and I get excited when I don't know a flag. Maria, I saw you came off. Did you want to share?
No, I was just done being camera off and I wanted to show you my support. I'm sorry.
No. I'm so happy to see you. Just wanted to make sure you were heard if desired. So I wanted to share those as well if you see those popping around. They similar to the terminology, there's often flag glossaries that are pretty cool to browse if you're curious. Polyflag was updated. Yes, Beck, thank you. It was updated after I did updated this, but the new polyflag is gorgeous. And as Maria mentioned, talking about intersections of identities, I wanted to bring in Kimberly Crenshaw's idea of intersectionality and kind of in a really brief form define that or really root it as a term that emerged from Black feminism to address the dual oppressions experienced by Black women through racism and sexism. The idea that Black women were experiencing, right, this double pinch of racism and sexism at the intersection. Oftentimes this word now gets used to kind of talk about the ways that each of us individually hold multiple identities, because I think that's a little bit easier to wrap our heads around. But I'm going to encourage people to like stretch that understanding a little bit and bring back the idea of that like pinch at the intersection. That it is, yes, true that we all hold multiple identities, but what Crenshaw, I think, is really asking us to hold here is not just those multiple identities, but the ways in which those identities are piled on by structural oppression, and how that piling on happens differently based on what intersection you're standing on.
Jack, there was a question in the Q&A that actually ties in really nicely here. An attendee asked, in the past, I've come across folks stating the term intersectionality is overused and not proper to use and or often misunderstood. Perhaps you can help clarify this. Jack or Maria, if you have any thoughts on this, please feel free.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. And I think that hopefully this is what I was gesturing towards a little bit, that I feel like intersectionality has, in the kind of common parlance or the overused parlance, been like to talk about like the container that we put all of our identities in. Like I could say like, okay, I'm Indigenous and I'm trans and I'm, I have a college education and da 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 da. Okay, this is my intersectionality. It's like that's the bucket of who I am, and that to me is often how it's used. But I think that maybe is missing some of the original intent of talking about how who I am in that, like with those collection of identities, is decontextualized from the structural pressures being put on that, on those identities. There are some ways in which I face structural pressure. So we can think about maybe that container in like a vice in some ways, and some ways in which my identities confer onto me privilege. So that container is reinforced. I am like light skinned. I'm Indigenous, but I'm light. And so I don't face the same kind of anti-indigeneity and like anti-Indigenous racism that some of my family members do, some of the other elements of my community do. And so in that way, my container isn't in that vice grip in the same way that like Indigenous Black people are, like for instance. So I hope that that is a little bit helpful. My container metaphor is intersectionality is often like, this is my list of identities, and not intersectionality is the result of, or the pain of, or the weight of the overlapping structural oppressions that make it harder to carry this list of identities. Maria, do you have any thoughts?
I think you covered it beautifully. you know, because our various intersections, all of us have these intersections. I think that a lot of times people may get confused because they think that intersectionality is more a way of defining those who are different only, you know, when in reality, all of us, every single person on this planet exists with various intersections and different, it's just part of, like you put it, in that container. So, and to me, it just becomes kind of simple. It's just to see the humanity in everyone first before we even attempt to try to determine, okay, what intersection or this or that. But yeah, I think that you clarified it beautifully.
Thank you. I think that the intersectionality, when put on the individual scale, isn't as effective as when we say, here is the individual in the context of like the structural forces. And the structural is what I think that Crenshaw was addressing, especially in talking about the workforce marginalization and oppression that like Black women were facing in the workplace that she was responding to. I think conceptualizing and contextualizing Crenshaw back as like a legal theorist is really important in that regard. Like she wasn't just talking about identity, she was talking about the law and the workforce, and how to like embed that within Black feminism, and then how did that kind of like proliferate out into the world. So I think it's an incredibly important and useful concept, but I think a lot of things lose its utility if decontextualized. But yeah, let's pop back to that if we have some time, because I think it's crucial. So to that point, I wanted to say that we're not talking about separate communities when we're talking about queer folks and disabled folks. According to the US Census Bureau, this is the pulse survey data. So this was over 6 weeks or so they took this data. So over 15% of respondents indicated one or more disability types. That's overall. When they broke it down and disaggregated it by gender identity and sexual orientation, that number became about 21% for LGBTQI people or LGBT people, as they defined it in the survey, and about 38% for trans respondents. That's a rate of about 160% higher than the overall participants, and about 280% higher for trans respondents. So in short, and then I broke it down in a chart based on the disability types that the survey used. So hearing, seeing, remembering, and mobility. And what we see across the chart is that for each disability category or disability type, the rates are higher of folks indicating who are LGBT and people who are trans, indicating that they have one or more disability types in that category. So if you're interacting with disabled community members, if you're, when you're working with your consumers, statistically speaking, you are more likely to be working with LGBT people, especially trans folks, based on this survey. And if we put it another way, it's suggested that 2.5 million LGBTQI plus people have disabilities. And those numbers here are broken down by a couple of different identity categories: 40% of trans adults, 40% of bisexual men, 36% of lesbian women, 36% of bisexual women, and 26% of LGBTQ students. So talking about youth here, reported being bullied or harassed due to an actual or perceived disability. And so here, when we're talking again about intersectionality, I'm thinking about the intersection of homophobia, transphobia, and ableism, talking about those structural pieces. And again, in the workplace, disabled LGBTQ people receive unemployment at a rate 3.4% higher than non-disabled LGBTQ people. And if we're looking at LGBT community centers, we see that there are differences in their accessibility. While 73% had accessible restrooms and fountains, and 70% had accessible parking, 16% had Braille signs or materials, 13% had PTY services. So differences, right? And for whom are LGBT community centers accessible? We see not everyone, regardless of the fact that it could be useful, right? Based on our disability types chart, we're seeing a gap that these spaces are needed. They're not accessible for everyone. So you could teach a whole course about this. We could have a whole summer retreat about this. But I wanted to provide a little bit of history that intertwines and highlights the fact that like these aren't separate communities for the most part, right? Folks have been here and are here. And so I really named this section Identity, Community, Advocacy, and Legacy. I wanted, you know, we could start anywhere. We could start at the dawn of time. But I started here in World War II because it sets a really important precedent. In that World War II, you know, many folks are joining the military or the war effort at home, for one. For two, some people are joining more urban spaces and finding queer community, LGBT community for the first time in urban centers. And there's an incredible focus on the medicalization of what at the time was called transsexuality and homosexuality, that these were deeply entwined into the medical model, both as like physical ailments and ideas of mental illness. And so I have snippets here from this self-help, not self-help, but letter to a help article in a newspaper asking for help being like attracted to my own sex. And the person writes back, "Our advice is that you seek a service of a competent medical practitioner. It's obvious that you are in need of his counsel." And at the same time, Christine Jorgensen's transition was all over the news, and she was seen as kind of a global phenomenon. She was a GI who transitioned overseas and was really heralded for being beautiful and glamorous. So there's this kind of duality during the war years. The post-war years, we see a crackdown really as people try to get like returning GIs back into you know, like heterosexual white middle class like normalcy, right? The war is over, everything has to go back. And the criminalization and medicalization of homosexuality, transsexuality amps up. And I'm using the parlance of the day, not what I would use now, importantly. And we still are embedded in the medical model. Again, from newspapers of the time, we have an article on how to understand the lesbian. An excerpt says, "Some claim that a girl turns to member of her own sex because of some endocrinal defect. This may be true, but such cases are very limited. There are various psychogenic factors: hatred of men, protest against the female sex role, defiance of sex laws and orders." We have other newspapers, Doctors Can't Cure, own sex deviation. There was a sting on men looking for sex in public spaces, you know, cruising. Counsel said McGuire intended to undergo psychiatric treatment and return to his family. Again, the intertwining of criminality, marginalization, the medicalization of these identities, and in fact, attributing them, right, really closely to a medical or you know, psychogenic difference. And at the same time, some of those returning GIs are advocating for the accessibility of college campuses, public spaces, for folks who were injured during the war and came back with mobility differences, came back utilizing wheelchairs. Important to note is that GI bills and GI benefits weren't available to everyone. There were many people who were dismissed from the military because they were or were suspected to be gay, or suspected to have a mental illness, or were Black. and they were given so-called blue paper dismissals, which weren't honorable discharges, they weren't dishonorable discharges, they were a secret third thing, which meant that you had to leave the military, you had to leave your career, you had you were outed essentially to everyone because everyone knew what a blue paper meant, and you could not receive any of the GI benefits, including student loans and housing and business loan, low interest loans. So the ways in which many people of this generation built intergenerational wealth and gained access to education, affordable housing, and things like that weren't accessible to people who got these blue paper dismissals. And again, those blue paper dismissals were often based on ability, perceived disability, perceived sexual orientation or activity, or race. And so I wanted to highlight that there was an incredible amount of advocacy being done at this time, but that advocacy didn't include everyone necessarily. If you're advocating for accessibility in universities that you now have access to as a GI with GI benefits, who doesn't have GI benefits? So I also have a timeline here. There's not going to be a test. I know that this is a lot of text. This is for you as a resource. But I wanted to kind of start pulling up questions as we think about this history, about what is the impact of medicalization when we talk about a disability, when we talk about sexual orientation or gender identity, because you know, homosexuality, gender dysphoria, gender identity has been listed in the DSM by the APA for decades, and had staggered off in terms of being demedicalized or being no longer listed as diagnostic criteria. We also want to think about when we think about the multiple advocacy efforts and movements, what constitutes private space and public space, and who has access to it. And I know that that's an incredible, important cornerstone to many of the shared efforts of the movements between the independent living movement and the queer rights and like LGBTQI plus movements. You know, thinking about the Civil Rights Act, outlawing racial segregation based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in 1964. In fact, who is left out of that? How does Medicaid and the Social Security Act define family and define self-advocacy or self-determination? And so pulling us forward into the Cold War. And again, we see the rise in, so sorry, my brain is just blanked. The rise in policing and oppressing people out of positions of power, out of jobs during the what's called the Lavender Scare, for people who have federal positions, federal jobs, no longer being considered trustworthy, in fact, being considered devious and potential spies if they are homosexual. But something that this marginalization started to do was create a sense of community in opposition to this othering. And what you start seeing is starting to format these early organizing and protest movements through the homophile organizations that said that, you know what, like homosexuals are different. They accepted the medical model of difference and said, like, maybe we have an illness, but why would you treat someone with an illness different? And so we see that as the first tactic to pushing against oppression, marginalization, job loss. But while the homophile movements, predominantly white, predominantly middle class, predominantly professionals, are working on that, you have people in the streets that are being like harassed as well. Felicia Flames down here, we didn't give it a shit about organizing. We were just trying to survive. we have a duality here. People are fighting for their rights, they're fighting for their lives in different ways. And I think maybe that resonates. And we see really a highlight of that with Stonewall, which many people think of as the catalyst for gay liberation movement or the LGBTQIA plus pride movement. In fact, there were a number of riots or moments of pushback prior to that, but this is the one that received media attention, where attendees at the Stonewall Club had enough of police raids one night and fought back, and the riots or the revolutions or the nights of protest that followed were a media sensation and led the next year to the Gay Liberation Front's first ever Pride Parade in 1970. And we continue on with our timeline in the 70s and 80s into the 90s. We start seeing more visibility for leaders like Harvey Milk. We also see greater pushback, right, with Anita Bryant and the Save Our Children campaign. We're seeing echoes of that now, I believe, as well. Who are our children, right? Who gets to decide for themselves, own their own bodies. I think there's oftentimes overlaps in terms of youth and adolescence and queer identity and disability in terms of sovereignty over one's self. We're starting to see in the 80s as well, first cases of HIV and AIDS, and starting to see really additional coalitions happening and conference spaces. People are starting to come together. We see the first Disabled Lesbian Conference in 1981. And so when we're thinking about movements and history, how do coalitions and intersectional spaces relate? How do they differ? What are the strengths and the challenges of those spaces? And really like a host of additional important advocacy efforts, right? Deaf President Now, the Capitol Crawl. And 1990 as well, there was the first ever Disability Pride Parade held in Boston. And always kind of keeping an ear to, or a thought to, or an eye to who may be left out of these policy advances. If we're all moving forward a little bit, who's left behind? What is the next piece of work that needs to be done? And we see a swing back in 1993 with Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act. And thinking, still, is marriage accessible for all? So I know we're zipping through this, but this is a resource for you all and a place to hang additional important dates. Wanted to highlight, right, the Gay Liberation Day Parade in 1970, a year after Stonewall, that kicked off Pride parades immemorial up till today. Those are two pictures to the left are of the Gay Liberation Day Parade held in New York. And there's one picture on the right that is of the first ever Disability Pride Parade in 1990 with a banner that reads, "Injustice everywhere is a threat to justice everywhere," an MLK quote. And I wanted to put these together because I think that though they are 20 years apart, 2 decades apart, I think that they're a really important echo, a really important maybe mirror of work. So I wanted to share that and highlight that. We're zipping through. There is a newspaper article here that I wanted to spotlight. October 6th, 1990, the first Disability Pride Day happens in Boston. And a few quotes that I pulled out read, "In the tradition of the gay pride and Black power movements, the first ever Disability Pride Day was held here. Far from tragic, disability is a natural part of the human experience," a quote by the Disability Pride Day Coalition. This day was sponsored by the Boston SIL, the AIDS Action Committee, the Disabled People's Liberation Front, Boston Commission for Persons with Disabilities, Deaf Inc., the Boston Self-Help Center, and many other organizations. And Carrie Dearborn said in this article, pride demonstrations are, quote, a way for people to shed internalized oppression. So I thought it was really important to just note that, again, for many folks, these are not separate fights or separate movements. This is like a lived reality where people can stand in their full selves, and that CILs have been a part of this. That in 1990, the Boston organization stood by and with their consumers for this event. So y'all are in this history. Y'all are doing this important work there in Boston in 1990. And that, 1990 wasn't the end, right? Or the beginning of activism that people have been involved in. Decades of activism and service continue. And disabled queer folks have been here and will be here for these fights. And I wanted to highlight that and to name that in movements such as, ACT UP, or really anything to do with generations that lived with and continue to live with AIDS, that the older adults, the elders that we are honestly blessed to have with us, I'm gesturing towards something here, trying to articulate something here about legacy, about wisdom, about activism and service, and not going quietly into that dark night, and instead really truly being leaders. And yeah, I'll get back to that. Thank you all for helping me hold the space to think through that. Wanted to continue a timeline. I won't linger on this other than to just say that I learned through some of this work that some very pivotal and important policy changes have had disabled LGBTQI plus folks at their heart. And I didn't know that. And so I wanted to spotlight folks, including Jim and John, the people behind the Supreme Court case that enabled, LGBTQI plus, what was called at the time same-sex marriage. I liked this picture on the right where they are younger. This was in 1993 because I think they just look really cheeky and happy. And there is a picture on the left where they are in the plane on the tarmac where they got married because John was not medically able to leave the plane or the tarmac to get married that day. But they had been denied the ability to get married in their home state, Ohio, and they flew out. And this was the Supreme Court case that led to federal recognition of, quote, same-sex marriage. And I did not know that John Arthur had ASL, and that, not ALS rather, and that he passed a couple of months after they got married, and that Jim had really carried on their love and legacy into the decades that followed. So I wanted to spotlight that because I think it's really important that folks like me having these conversations, rediscover and holds our living history. There's actionable steps here. I know people were asking about this. Some things that I suggest for creating a welcoming and affirming environment is to work locally, interpersonally, environmentally, and organizationally, building coalition, like Maria said, with LGBTQI plus resources and leaders. Who's around you, who's doing the work already, and how can you connect and support them? So, participating in local pride events and advocating for accessibility at those events. Interpersonally, using non-assumptive language, introducing yourself with name and pronoun, making your DEIA policies accessible and available in multiple formats, including physical signals of support, organizationally, couple more things, and we're running a little bit low on time. I have examples of welcoming language, practicing pronoun usage, if that's something that's kind of like more new for you to be thinking about intentionally, making space for belonging and connection when you're talking about who might exist in people's worlds, and who might be their support systems. Like, for instance, instead of asking who in your family supports you, asking who in your household or community supports you, asking what else would be helpful for them to know, for you to know about them, and really making a note about terminology changes, that language changes over time and across communities, and that people may use terms for themselves that are no longer considered polite or affirming by other people in the community. But it's important to not necessarily correct them, right? Because that may be something that like really is meaningful for them. And to making, especially working with older adults, I found making an affirming environment without necessarily naming it can be something that creates a safer space. You two make a great team, or how long have you known each other or lived together, and giving them the space to lean into sharing with you when they trust you. And then how you bounce back from accidentally using the wrong pronoun or name for someone, if that comes up, or looking for information for a consumer. If you keep information, could your information be under a different name? Or is there a chance that another organization had you listed under a different name? And that's it from me. I'm sorry that we don't have so many moments for questions, but I'm so excited to hear from you all. And like I said, I do have resources there for folks. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, both Jack and Maria. I'm looking through the questions in our question and answer. And I think most of these have been touched upon. Alexandra, Aaron, to your point, we absolutely do need Still Suite to recognize other gender identities. It would go a long way. Still Suite, Jack, for context, is the documentation program that a lot of centers for independent living use with their consumers. And I believe currently it only offers male or female as options for gender identity. So that's absolutely feedback that can be given to them. Beck asked, is this identity / expression / presentation breakdown the newly accepted way to explain this? Or was expression / presentation specifically broken out for this PowerPoint? I have never heard of it before.
Yeah, great question. I don't think it's like a newly accepted way to do anything. It was a way that I was wrapping my mind around what does it mean to do gender in context with others. Yeah, I hope that makes a little bit more sense, but it's not been really like reviewed by anyone or anything. If you have notes, I'm obviously more than happy, love to workshop it if it's not something that like resonated or felt off.
Sorry, my keyboard is, I forget how loud my keyboard is. I was just responding to Tyler's response about Still Suite, which is that the PPR report, the federal government doesn't recognize other sexes and genders in their report. So it sounds like there's more work for us to do at the federal level. As a brief reminder, April does host a monthly advocacy meeting, which is open to our membership, and you can find information on our website, which I will put in the chat.
At that point, sometimes I find that naming the limitations can sometimes take that pressure off. If a limitation in the Still Suite, if you have that kind of like opportunity in an interaction to say like, we have these options in this program, I understand that there are many more gender options than these. I apologize for these limitations. Something like that can let folks know that you see that there's a structural issue, and that yeah.
Tom, go for it.
Well, I think one of the things that we all should think about is talking to each other and coming together a little bit more on this to strategize in the SIL world what we can do. There's a lot of things happening right now. We got a 504 thing that we need to look at and look at some of the language that we can put in there. There's many things we can do together, you know. I mean, you know, just having a Zoom every once in a while. Hey, just pick up the phone, see someone on this Zoom that you think might, you know, you might like. Go ahead and, you know, call them. Use the fucking phone. You know, let's get together. These things are things are happening. We really don't have time to sit back. You know, there's if you're an activist, it's because there's activity happening out here. You know, let's try to be more active and try to be activists. Thank you. It was a good one. Thank you.
Well, folks, our time has just about come to an end. I will be sending out the recording and Jack's PowerPoint. I hope to have it by the end of the week. And if you have any questions or want to be connected potentially to our panelists, please shoot me an email. You can find me at aritter@april-rural.org. And I'm happy to help make connections. Again, thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. And hopefully we will see you all at the April conference next month. Thank you, everyone.
So much.